I've been married to Laura for nearly 4 years now, and on the surface, everything seemed fine. We had a cozy home, a circle of friends who loved us, and the kind of relationship people envied, at least that's what I thought. I always imagined we were rock solid, like the kind of couple who'd grow old together. But, as they say, appearances can be deceiving. Over the past year, there were subtle shifts I couldn't quite put my finger on. I'd catch her glancing at her phone, hiding the screen whenever I walked into the room. She started working late a lot more often, which was strange since she'd never been one to bring work home. When I'd ask, she'd snap, claiming I was being controlling or paranoid. But the truth is, deep down I was starting to worry. Friends would ask if we were okay, and I'd laugh it off, saying that every couple has rough patches. But it wasn't just a rough patch. There was something dark looming over us. Despite my gut screaming at me, I kept giving her the benefit of the doubt. That was my first mistake. Now, we're in counseling, but it's painfully clear that it won't fix anything. Sitting across from her in that sterile office with the counselor between us feels like torture. She's so rehearsed, as if she's trying to win some performance award. I can't believe I'm even still trying after what I discovered. The painful truth is that Laura has been lying and betraying me, and counseling won't fix something that's already dead. But let me rewind and tell you how I found out just how deep her betrayal went. Looking back, I can't believe I missed the signs. Maybe I didn't want to see them. Ignorance, as they say, can be bliss, but only until reality slaps you across the face. That slap came about a year ago on a night I'll never forget. I had been on a work trip, and Laura knew I wasn't supposed to be home until the following day. But plans changed. I managed to catch an early flight, thinking it would be a sweet surprise to come home to her. I didn't even text her, just grabbed my bags and took a cab straight home, excited to be back in my own bed with my wife by my side. The moment I stepped inside, I felt something was off. It was unusually quiet, yet there was this strange tension in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. And then I noticed it. A trail of clothes scattered on the floor, leading from the living room all the way down the hallway to our bedroom. A pit formed in my stomach. The shirt on the floor wasn't mine. The shoes lying by the sofa weren't mine. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sounds of her and some stranger in our bed. I wish I could say I reacted calmly, but in that moment, rage flooded through me like a tidal wave. Every fiber of my being wanted to burst into that room and drag that scumbag out by his collar. I even reached for my old cricket bat, which was tucked away in the front closet. It was heavy in my hands, solid, and all I could think about was making him regret ever coming near her. But as my hand tightened around it, a single thought stopped me. Consequences. One violent outburst and my whole life could change. Jail time wasn't worth it. Not for them. Instead, I took a deep breath, set the bat aside, and decided on something a bit more subtle but just as satisfying. I gathered up every single piece of clothing they'd strewn around my house, walked it out to the trash can, and tossed it all in. Then, without a word, I left. After dumping their clothes in the trash, I felt an odd, fleeting sense of relief, but I knew it wouldn't last. I couldn't bear to stay there a second longer, so I did the only thing that made sense. I turned off my phone, got in my car, and drove straight to my buddy Chris's place across town. Chris and I have been friends since high school. He's the kind of friend you can show up on the doorstep for, unannounced, with a story like mine, and he'd have your back without a second thought. When I got there, Chris could tell from the look on my face that something was terribly wrong. He didn't ask any questions, just poured me a drink. One drink turned into 3, and before I knew it, we were downing shots like we were back in college. Every sip burned, and with it, the shock started to fade, replaced by a dull, heavy ache in my chest. At some point in the night, Chris's wife, Mia, found us in their backyard, a sad heap of anger and alcohol. She took one look at us, sighed, and hosed us off with the garden spray, laughing at the pitiful sight we made. I actually managed to laugh a little, drenched and miserable, but feeling oddly alive for the first time since I stepped into my house that night. By the time morning rolled around, I had a pounding headache and an even stronger urge to avoid my problems. But, as expected, when I finally turned my phone back on, I was greeted with dozens of missed calls and messages. The first few were frantic, worried ones from Laura, asking why I hadn't let her know I'd be home early. She wanted to know if I was okay, if something had happened on my flight, since she'd noticed I'd missed my return time. Then, the tone shifted. Laura's texts went from concerned to enraged. She'd come home to find the house in complete disarray, clothes missing, and me nowhere to be found. At first, she was terrified, thinking someone had broken in. But soon enough, she put the pieces together. The messages spiraled from there, each one angrier and more erratic than the last. By the end, she was calling me childish, blaming me for the mess I'd created. But the real kicker was what came next. The morning after my drunken escape, my head felt like it had been put through a blender. Chris handed me a cup of coffee and muttered something about how I looked like a train wreck. And honestly, that's exactly what I felt like. I sat there, bleary-eyed and bracing myself, scrolling through the chaos on my phone. The text messages from Laura read like a spiral into madness, each one more absurd than the last. The first few messages were concerned, almost sweet. Laura was asking if I was okay, why I hadn't told her I'd be coming home early. She had seen the notification of my flight change, but when I didn't show up at the expected time, she claimed she'd been worried sick. The nerve. I shook my head, disgusted by how easy it was for her to feign concern. Did she think I was that clueless? Did she really believe I hadn't seen what was right in front of me? But then the mood shifted fast. Once she came home to an empty house with her lover's clothes missing, Laura's tone switched from worried to irritated, then downright angry. In her mind, I was the villain here. The messages were furious, full of accusations and insults. She called me juvenile and reckless, like I was some kind of immature child throwing a tantrum. She even accused me of being petty for messing up her clothes that, mind you, had been stripped off in my living room by some guy who had no business even being in my home. Then, in one particularly infuriating text, she had the nerve to tell me I overreacted, that I was blowing things out of proportion, making it into a big deal when it was just a momentary lapse in her judgment. According to her, it was all just a mistake, a one-time thing that meant nothing, and my dramatic reaction was the real issue. I nearly smashed my phone right then and there. The sheer arrogance of it made my blood boil. She'd betrayed me, shattered every ounce of trust, and was now trying to gaslight me into thinking I was the one in the wrong. But it wasn't over yet. No, Laura had more surprises waiting for me, as I'd soon learn. As the messages piled up, I kept scrolling, feeling my chest tighten with every passing minute. I could sense Laura's desperation escalating as she realized her sweet talk and gaslighting weren't working. Eventually, the messages became outright frantic. She must have been pacing around our home, wondering what I'd do next or if I was going to expose her affair. But her anxiety wasn't about me or our marriage. It was all about the fallout for her and her precious friend. The text started mentioning him, too. She didn't even bother hiding his name anymore, Mark. I couldn't believe I was reading her words as she defended this guy, as if he deserved some kind of sympathy from me. She claimed he was a good man going through a hard time, and that they'd simply found comfort in each other. Comfort. I clenched my jaw, disgusted at the way she was trying to romanticize her betrayal. Just as I was about to throw my phone across the room, a new series of texts caught my attention. They were from an unknown number, but the first line immediately made my heart race. It was Mark's wife. She introduced herself as Sarah, and her first message was straightforward. I know about Laura and Mark. It hit me like a punch. Sarah knew. She'd been tracking down information on my wife's affair, and somehow, she'd managed to find my number. Sarah went on to tell me how she'd suspected something was wrong for a while, but hadn't been able to confirm anything until that night. Turns out, Mark had left the house wearing his usual clothes, but he returned home wearing something entirely different. A sloppy ensemble of oversized clothes he must have grabbed in a panic after I'd thrown his original outfit in the garbage. That was what tipped her off. Seeing him in clothes that were clearly not his size, smelling faintly of Laura's perfume, had been all the evidence she needed. Apparently, she had trailed Mark's friend back to my house and seen him walking out. She had taken photos, sent them to a lawyer, and was already working on putting an end to her marriage. Her text read, "I just thought you should know that I'm done with this mess. I've got all I need to make sure he doesn't walk away from this unscathed." As I read her words, a strange satisfaction welled up inside me. This wasn't just about Laura anymore. Her actions had created collateral damage that she couldn't control. Sarah's prenup with Mark included an infidelity clause, and because of the proof she'd gathered, she was now entitled to a considerable payout. Mark was going to lose a lot of money, his reputation, and his marriage, all because he couldn't keep his hands off my wife. I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication knowing he'd suffer for this, that he wouldn't walk away without consequences. I was done being the one who had to endure all the pain and humiliation. Laura had set off a chain reaction, and the wreckage was now spreading, swallowing up everyone who'd been complicit in this betrayal. But the fallout wasn't over, not for me and certainly not for Laura. A few days after I'd spoken with Sarah, I decided it was time to confront Laura head-on. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, an apology, maybe a shred of regret, but I needed to look her in the eyes and see if there was any semblance of the woman I once loved. I didn't want to keep feeling like a ghost in my own life, haunted by unanswered questions and buried rage. So, I texted her, told her we needed to talk, and asked her to meet me at the counselor's office. Laura arrived, looking almost fragile, which only fueled my anger. She wore this mask of innocence, like she'd done nothing wrong, like she was the wronged one. It was as if she believed that, with enough acting, she could somehow rewrite the past. When we sat down, she immediately launched into her carefully rehearsed lines, talking about how our communication breakdown had pushed her into making mistakes. She actually had the nerve to blame me, saying that I'd been too focused on work and not emotionally available. I held up my hand to stop her. I told her that I already knew everything. About her affair with Mark, about their so-called comfort in each other, about the nights she'd brought him into our home. I laid it all out, watching as her face shifted from shock to defiance. And then, in a moment of sheer audacity, she crossed her arms and glared at me, saying, "I don't know why you're so dramatic about this. I made one mistake, and you're acting like I'm the villain." That word, mistake, rang in my ears like a siren. A mistake was something small, an accidental word, a forgotten anniversary, not a full-blown affair that had ripped our lives apart. I told her that she didn't just make a mistake. She shattered our marriage, betrayed every ounce of trust I'd placed in her, and destroyed the future I thought we were building together. She rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed, as if I was being unreasonable. But what she said next took the cake. Laura brought up Mark's divorce, insisting that my actions had caused him significant financial harm. She claimed that if I hadn't thrown his clothes out and exposed him, he wouldn't be losing so much money to his soon-to-be ex-wife. According to her twisted logic, his ruined marriage was my fault, as if I was somehow responsible for the outcome of her affair. I was stunned. She was blaming me for the consequences of her own betrayal, defending the man she cheated with, and accusing me of being the one at fault. She had no remorse, no shame, no willingness to take responsibility. This was the woman I'd pledged my life to, the woman I had loved. And here she was, defending her lover's bank account as if that held more importance than the destruction she'd wrought on our lives. When I saw that cold indifference in her eyes, any lingering hope of reconciliation evaporated. I knew, in that moment, that there was nothing left to salvage. She didn't feel guilt or regret, only anger that her web of lies had unraveled. I took a deep breath, looked her square in the eye, and said the words I'd been dreading but knew had to be said. "We're done, Laura. I'm filing for divorce." Her face fell, but not from sadness. It was pure frustration, as though she'd lost control of a situation she thought she could manipulate. She started arguing, calling me selfish, claiming that I was running away instead of working through our issues. But her words felt hollow, like the desperate attempts of someone grasping at a sinking ship. I walked out of that session without looking back, feeling an overwhelming mix of relief and devastation. After I walked out of that counseling session, I felt like I was finally stepping out of a fog. The air was sharper, colder, but at least it was real. For the first time in months, I felt like I could see things clearly. Laura's reaction in that office left no doubts. She had no remorse. In her mind, this mess wasn't her fault. It was everyone else's problem to deal with. I knew it was over, and I knew I had to start moving on, even if the weight of betrayal was still pressing down on me like an anchor. I went straight from the counseling office to my temporary apartment, a small place I'd found shortly after everything went down. I couldn't stomach the thought of living under the same roof as her after seeing what she was capable of. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to process everything, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah, Mark's soon-to-be ex-wife. She wanted to meet in person to compare notes, as she put it. Normally, I'd have declined. Keeping my distance from this drama seemed like the healthiest choice, but curiosity got the better of me. Maybe there was something cathartic about facing the other person who had been hurt by this nightmare. We met at a quiet cafe a few days later. Sarah looked as exhausted as I felt, with dark circles under her eyes and a guarded expression. We both sat down and ordered coffee, neither of us sure where to begin. After a few moments of awkward silence, she broke the ice by sliding a small stack of papers across the table. It was a collection of phone records, screenshots, and a few candid photos that told the entire story of their affair. Dates, locations, times, it was all there. As I flipped through the evidence, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How had they hidden all of this so seamlessly? How had they kept up this elaborate facade without either of us catching on? Sarah leaned in, speaking in a hushed tone. You know, they've been seeing each other for almost a year. Mark would tell me he had late meetings, business trips, even weekend workshops. I believed him, she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. I feel like a fool, like I ignored all the warning signs because I wanted to believe the best in him. I nodded, feeling the sting of familiarity. I had believed in Laura, too. I had wanted so badly to hold on to the idea that our marriage was unbreakable, that we were just going through a rough patch like every couple does. But the truth was uglier than I ever imagined. I had given her trust, loyalty, and patience, while she was busy sneaking around behind my back, pretending everything was fine. But then Sarah dropped a bombshell that I hadn't anticipated. She looked around the cafe, making sure no one was listening, and leaned in even closer. There's something else you should know. Mark, he's not just an ordinary guy. He's been involved in some shady business dealings, things that could come back to haunt him if certain people were to find out. I could feel my jaw tighten. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a potential threat to my safety and my peace of mind. Sarah continued, explaining that Mark had a history of bending the law in his financial dealings. If this information got out, he'd be facing more than a messy divorce. I looked at her, realizing that we were both holding fragments of this twisted puzzle, pieces that we hadn't known were missing. My heart pounded as I realized how close I'd come to unwittingly being part of something much darker than a simple affair. The more we talked, the more I understood that Laura and Mark's affair wasn't just some tragic love story. It was a calculated series of choices, a reckless disregard for the lives they were shattering. Sarah was visibly shaken by her own words, but there was a glint of resolve in her eyes. She wasn't going to let Mark walk away unscathed, and neither was I. By the end of our conversation, we both felt a strange sense of camaraderie. We were united by betrayal, by shared wounds and the burning need for justice. Sarah handed me copies of the evidence she'd gathered, including the incriminating details of Mark's shady business. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet, but just holding it in my hands felt like reclaiming a small piece of my own power. When I got back to my apartment, I sat down and stared at the papers, my mind racing with possibilities. I could use this evidence to make life very difficult for Laura and Mark. The thought of them finally facing consequences brought a bitter smile to my face. For so long, I had been the one carrying the burden of their lies. Now I had the power to turn the tables, but I knew I had to be careful. Revenge was tempting, and the thought of seeing Laura suffer for her actions was satisfying in ways I didn't want to admit. Yet, at the same time, I wanted to move forward without being weighed down by bitterness. The last thing I wanted was to let her steal any more of my peace, any more of my life. Still, a part of me knew that if I walked away without doing anything, it would haunt me forever. The decision I faced was heavier than anything I'd ever known. Sitting alone in that quiet apartment, the stack of evidence Sarah had given me in one hand and my wedding ring in the other, I felt the full weight of everything that had happened. I wanted justice. I wanted Laura to feel even a fraction of the betrayal and pain she'd inflicted on me. But I was also exhausted, emotionally, mentally, even physically. Every bone in my body was tired of carrying the bitterness and anger that had been with me since that night I walked in on her and Mark. The longer I stared at the evidence, the more a plan began to take shape, something that would allow me to get my closure without dragging myself down into the mud. I didn't need a dramatic, vengeful showdown. I just needed her to understand that she couldn't manipulate me anymore, that her lies had consequences she could no longer escape. And if it made her life uncomfortable, well, that would be a bonus. I spent the next few days preparing. First, I visited a lawyer to finalize my divorce paperwork. I wanted no ties left, no lingering connections that Laura could exploit. I arranged for everything to be handled quietly, behind the scenes. There would be no grand confrontation. I wanted her to feel the emptiness of what she had done, to understand that she had pushed me so far away that there was nothing left to discuss. Next, I decided it was time to return to our house one last time to gather my things. I made sure she'd be at work, so I'd have the place to myself. Walking through the front door was surreal. The place felt hollow, like a faded memory of a life I once lived. The walls held memories of happier days, of love and laughter, of a time when I actually believed in the vows we had made to each other. Now, those memories felt like someone else's life, like I was merely an observer looking back at a faded photograph. As I packed my belongings, I came across things that reminded me of her, little reminders of the woman she used to be before this deceit unraveled everything. I found our wedding album, tucked away on a shelf in the closet. I leafed through it, seeing her smile, her eyes full of a love I now knew had been an illusion. I'd planned to leave the album behind, but in a moment of quiet defiance, I took it with me. She didn't deserve to keep it, to look back on those memories as if they were hers alone. Once I had everything packed, I left her a letter. It wasn't a dramatic goodbye, no ranting or raging. I simply told her that I was done. I was done with her lies, her betrayal, and her lack of remorse. I told her that she could have her life with Mark or anyone else she chose, but she would never have a place in mine again. I wanted her to feel the emptiness of that loss, to understand that she had taken something good and turned it to ashes. Finally, there was one last step, the evidence. Sarah and I had kept in touch, both of us finding solace in knowing we weren't alone in our betrayal. She was moving forward with her own divorce, and her lawyer was thrilled to have the incriminating evidence against Mark. It would ensure her a fair settlement and protect her future. With her permission, I handed the rest of the evidence over to the attorney handling my case. He assured me it would be handled discreetly but would be there if it was ever needed, ready to strike if Laura or Mark tried to pull any more tricks. In that moment, I felt a strange calm. I didn't need to see Laura fall apart or Mark lose everything, but knowing that their actions would have consequences gave me a sense of peace. They wouldn't walk away from this unscathed, and that was enough. I walked out of that house for the last time, feeling lighter than I had in months. It was as though I was leaving behind a ghost, finally free from the weight of all that had happened. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like it was mine to shape. As the days passed, a strange sense of clarity settled over me. The legal wheels were in motion, both for my divorce from Laura and for Sarah's case against Mark. I was no longer looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next blow, the next betrayal. I felt like I'd finally taken back control over my own life, reclaiming the power I'd let slip away in my desperation to hold onto a marriage that was never as solid as I'd believed. In the quiet of my new apartment, I found myself reflecting on everything I'd been through. The man I was just a few months ago felt like a stranger. Someone willing to sacrifice his own happiness and peace to protect a relationship that had already died in Laura's eyes long before I knew. I realized that I had been holding onto the idea of who she was, of who we were, rather than the reality. My memories of her, of our good times, were just illusions, shadows of a past that had been tainted by her lies. There were moments when the anger flared up, hot and raw. I'd picture her indignant face in that counseling office, how she twisted the blame back on me as if I were the one who'd betrayed her. I'd remember her ridiculous insistence that I was somehow responsible for Mark's downfall, that I should feel sympathy for the man who'd shared my bed with my wife. But I'd learned to let those thoughts go. Holding on to anger, I realized, was only letting her control my emotions. I'd been chained to her betrayal for too long, and I was ready to cut those ties, to let her and Mark drown in the consequences of their own choices. One afternoon, I got a call from Sarah. She sounded lighter, relieved even. Mark had finally signed the divorce papers, knowing he had no leverage to fight the evidence she held. She thanked me, not just for the support, but for being an ally in this strange, twisted journey. We laughed at the absurdity of it all, two strangers brought together by a shared betrayal, now both standing on the edge of new lives. As we hung up, I felt an odd sense of gratitude for her, for having someone who understood the depths of the betrayal I'd experienced. In the following weeks, I started to rebuild. It was a process, slow and painful at times, but healing. I threw myself into things that gave me joy, rediscovering hobbies I'd neglected, reconnecting with old friends, and allowing myself to see a future untainted by Laura's shadow. The more distance I put between myself and that chapter of my life, the clearer I could see the lessons hidden in the pain. One evening, as I was walking through a nearby park, I found myself thinking about forgiveness. Not for her, not for Mark, but for myself. I had spent so long blaming myself, questioning my actions, wondering if I could have prevented her affair if I'd been more attentive, if I'd been better. But I saw now that nothing I did or didn't do would have changed who she was. Laura had made her choice and Mark had too. Their betrayal was a reflection of their own weaknesses, not of my inadequacies. Finally understanding that was liberating. By the time the divorce was finalized, I felt a profound sense of closure. There were no more lingering questions, no more loose threads to untangle. I was free, and in that freedom, I found a quiet strength I didn't know I had. I realized that, even in the face of betrayal and loss, I could rebuild myself, piece by piece. If I had any advice for anyone going through something similar, it would be this: trust your instincts, and don't let anyone make you feel guilty for standing up for yourself. Love shouldn't demand that you sacrifice your self-respect or endure dishonesty. If someone is willing to betray you, they don't deserve the best parts of you. As I walked home that evening, I looked up at the sky, feeling the crisp air fill my lungs. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt hopeful. This new beginning was mine alone, and I intended to make the most of it. The weight of the past had finally lifted, and with it, I was ready to move forward into whatever life had in store.